No BS podcast here on RT.com. I'm your host, Ben Swann. It is 10 a.m. Eastern time here in the U.S. and a lot to talk about today. For the next 40 minutes, we're going to be talking with a series of guests about this idea of America divided. We are divided in a lot of ways right now, politically, and certainly divided on the issue of activism. What constitutes activism right now in this country? What does it actually look like? What does it mean to be an activist in the United States? Are some activists good and others bad? Is the very act of activism a negative? It really depends on who you talk to these days. You know, we've watched over the last few years a real accelerated growth of activism in this country. But I would say that it really goes back to around 2008, 2009, 2010 in the United States, when we really saw the real kind of growth of modern activism. Now, if you go back into the 1960s, obviously activism in the 1960s was kind of the bread and butter of the rebellion movement against the United States government. Vietnam was going on at the time. There were civil rights marches going on. There were the Vietnam protests. So there was a lot happening in the 1960s. And between the 1960s and about 2008, there was a lapse where activism kind of took a back seat to politics. And we saw more and more politics in a lot of different ways kind of growing. We saw the religious right pop up in the 1970s and 80s. We've seen a lot of different forms of political forces kind of taking the stage. But activism itself, after the Vietnam War came to an end, after the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it really started to take a back seat. Then in about 2008, 2009, 2010, we started to see new groups coming along. One of those groups was the Tea Party, which was on the right side of the political spectrum. We saw more and more of these conservatives who were saying, hey, we need to change the political system in America. We need to change the taxation system in America. We need to have more of a voice than what we've had in the past. We need to get rid of politicians who don't represent our interests. But while that was happening on the right, simultaneously, we saw growth of activism on the left in the form of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And Occupy Wall Street, which really came along around 2010, was a movement that said the Wall Street bankers and the Wall Street system in America is detrimental to the future of Americans. And so you saw thousands of Americans who began to take part in that. So on one side, you had tens of thousands of people involved in this thing called the Tea Party movement. On the other side, you had thousands of people becoming involved in something called the Occupy Wall Street movement. Interestingly, around that time, if you go back and you look at historically what was happening, and there are a number of studies that have been done on this, we began to see a shift take place that began to move America away from these issues of reforming politics and reforming Wall Street and the political or financial systems, and instead shift towards an obsession over race. Now, there are very real issues with race in America, as there are around the world. As a reporter, I've been reporting on them for the better part of a decade. And the issues of policing in America, very real issues about policing, very real issues about criminal justice. I would argue that a lot of that is less founded in race and more founded in socioeconomics, meaning that poor people are disproportionately treated in terms of the laws that are created, in terms of prison sentences, than just merely by someone's race. But race is certainly an issue as well. And so what we've seen over the last 10 years is a micro focus on race and an absence, if you will, an absence of focus on these issues of politics and the political class, the ruling class, and certainly the financial ruling class in the form of Wall Street. And so when we begin to look at what has happened, we fast forward to 2020, where we saw large marches in this country for justice and for social justice, for police reform. Some very effective protests that took place, and then some very violent protests that took place. Some protests that were meant to say we need to see real change in our systems, needed change in our systems, and then others that devolved into violence. And as that was happening, we also saw that was more on the left of the spectrum. And then on the right of the spectrum, we began to see more protests as well. Certainly what we saw at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was a riot that became out of control, coming from a political protest, a protest saying the political class isn't listening to us. So we've watched all of this kind of take shape. The problem is, and I'll be honest with you guys, some of you watching right now will be watching this, and you're going to be in the comments already, and you're going to be saying, no, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. It's all about race. You are going to genuinely believe that. There are going to be some people who are listening to this who say, no, this guy's absolutely right. It's not just about race. There are a lot of other issues besides race tearing this country apart, and we're micro-focusing on race because, quite candidly, politicians, it allows politicians to kind of put people into categories, to link them together, and to move them into these different, these different positions where we can really control the narrative. So if you think about it this way, when there's all this talk of the BLM protests and Black Lives Matter over 2020, and one thing that we saw take place is that corporate America got heavily behind this. That tells you something right there. And that doesn't mean everything corporate America does is wrong. But the fact that so many corporations got behind this makes you question, so what skin do you have in this game? Now, a lot of these corporations took a lot of money and they put it into foundations that don't necessarily have any accountability to them, that don't necessarily do anything to make the lives of people better. But we've seen it happen. And so you get to check off this box, this list that says, I've done my part, right, as corporate America. We've watched in 2021 already what's happened with this GameStop Wall Street Bets fiasco. And by the way, we did a whole conversation about this a couple of weeks ago. If you're interested in that subject, please check out our podcast specifically about the financial system, because there's a lot to be said about what was going on with GameStop and Wall Street Bets. And so what we're watching take place here in the United States right now, what we're watching taking place around the world is this back and forth, and it's micro-focused on race rather than being micro-focused on people as a whole and saying, is there a huge and growing discrepancy between those who have and those who don't have, and is that the real root of the problem? So that's what we're going to be talking with our guests today. In fact, we're going to bring in our first guest. Tara Szczepanski is going to join us. And Tara, thanks for being on the show. We're going to kind of break down some of this, and I believe, I'm going to let you tell your story. I believe that you, as an activist, actually were an anti-Trump activist who became a Trump supporter during the summer of last year, watching the riots that were taking place. Tell me a little bit about that story. How did that take place?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. So what had happened was I was anti-Trump at the start. I'm a walkaway, so I walked away from the Democratic Party. And basically what was my red pill wake-up moment was they vandalized the Kosciuszko statue, and I'm Polish. And so when I saw that the riots were going on this summer that amounted to over $2 billion worth of damage, to including over 150 federal buildings, and then also the countless lives that were also lost during the riots, and then though the movement was posed as a racial movement, when the amount of destruction doesn't then equate, there's something not right here. And so that was when I started really doing my research as to what was the state of America and understanding what Trump's policies were, because I assumed he was just racist from the start. I just assumed he was sexist, all the isms I assumed this man was. But when I really did my research to understand what his policies were and how great he has been for not just America, but for our relationship with the rest of the world, I was shocked to then realize such a discrepancy between what I was told by really the media and how that conditioned me to the way I was thinking, to when I did my own independent research and realized that I felt like I was being lied to. And then with that, I started critically analyzing what was going on with the riots. And then I started attending rallies and protests to listen to what people were saying, to see what was going on. And then with that, I started to do my own independent reporting of what was going on at these riots and peaceful protests, and from what I witnessed to what was then transposing onto the media was so different. And so that's why I encourage everyone to do their own independent research. That's how it turned me from being an anti-Trump person to being a Trump advocate. And that's really my story.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And now let's set Trump aside for a minute, because obviously,
Yes.
Trump is no longer president. We're living in a
Yes.
world without him as president. We have a
Yes.
whole new administration that's in place. They've talked a lot about unity, and yet it feels to me like we are not embracing unity as a culture. We're actually going the other direction, that there's more disunity, in part because certain groups of people are deemed the enemy, that people aren't just polarized towards each other. There is a growing hatred towards each other. So, this actress who was just fired by Disney, and she was in The Mandalorian, the comment that she made that she was fired over was, she said, in Nazi Germany, the Nazis made the general public in Germany hate the Jews because of their religion. She says, how is that different than making people hate each other over political beliefs? Now, she was fired over that, which kind of seems like a bit of a Nazi thing to do, but she was fired over that comment. And the question, though, is she historically right? Historically, what she's saying is accurate, that in order to move against groups of people throughout history, and by the way, this is true in lots of places besides Germany, in order to move against groups of people, you dehumanize them. You don't talk to them. You don't listen to them. You don't recognize that maybe they also have struggles as well. You dehumanize them. Do you feel that that's what's happening right now in America and really worldwide, that there is a dehumanizing of people who come from a different political point of view?
Absolutely. It's 100% what I am experiencing myself. And actually, what she spoke to is completely valid to the life that I'm even living. So when I was out reporting at the protests and riots, and what was labeled as peaceful protests, what was advertised as an anti-racism rally, one that I had attended on January 10th, I was actually attacked by BLM members during and Antifa members during that particular peaceful protest that was an anti-racism rally. And I'm mixed race, Asian and Polish. And so that was very ironic. As soon as they identified I was conservative media, they completely dehumanized me. They called me a Nazi. They said, don't protect her. I ran to the police for help. And the mob of 20, 30 people, on just myself, a single female, chased after me across the street as I sought help from the NYPD. And they told the NYPD, don't help her. She's a Nazi. She's a Trump supporter. And so by being labeled by my conservative views, and really the right side of ideology being villainized in what's going on, that dehumanizes us by the label. And so it's as if I no longer had a right to protection, a right to not be harmed physically because of my conservative views. And so what this actress Gina was saying in her statement, absolutely, because we have instances where neighbors are turning against neighbors. With the Capitol riots, there were family members turning in people who were inside and who were sought after by the FBI. And so you have instances that families turning against families, neighbors turning against neighbors. And if a person such as myself just being identified as a conservative, no longer having a right to protection, and literally the image that she had posted on her social media of being chased down the street, that was me. And it's also something I experienced on my social media, saying that since I'm a conservative and that I was pro-Trump, that this is justified. This is what I'm being told, that what happened to me is justified because of my political views.
Let's bring in Khaled Beydoun. He's a law professor, and we'll bring him into the conversation. Tara, stay with us. We'll continue this with you. Khaled, thank you for joining us. Let's talk a little bit about what Tara was just saying. I mean, this idea that there are activists from many different stripes, many different ways of life, political point of views, just across the board. As we watch those many different groups now collide with each other, because it feels like that's where we are, they're on a collision course with each other. Is there a dehumanizing that's taking place right now? I've read some of your work and the things that you have talked about in terms of Islamophobia and the way that Muslims are treated, even dehumanized throughout their experience worldwide. Is that what's happening right now in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, first, good morning. Thanks for having me. I think so. I think that what's taking place today is an extension of what's been going on in the United States for a long time. Now, Black activists, Muslim activists, Latinx activists, activists of color at large who protest, who take to the streets and assemble, have been not only been dehumanized for a long time and denied their First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly, but have been demonized for a long time as a consequence of the way they look. So what's happening today is an extension of that, and what the guest is talking about, that her political views are sort of censoring her and are leading to her silencing. I think much of that is a product of the rights work and the development of the rights, the far rights, culture of silencing the rights in the assembly of individuals on the left. It's effectively, turning back to condemn and silence those who are on the right now.
And where does that lead us? Because when you begin to turn these conversations, and we'll get Tara back here in a minute, when you turn these conversations into something different than conversations, right? And it becomes an act of violence or the dehumanizing. It's not like by dehumanizing one group, the second group then feels better and says, well, okay, then I see what's happened to you. Let's all get along. And don't things begin to dehumanize each other, and you get into a vicious cycle of people now hating each other, and it becomes even more conflict?
Well, I mean, possibly. Look, the reality is this, is that the United States right now is a very ideologically polarized place. It's been a very racially polarized place. And the rise of, how do I frame this? Sort of like short form soundbite discourse, right? People just essentially sort of flouting out sound bites instead of engaging in genuine and robust conversation is exacerbating this polarization. That's why you have individuals who are on the far right being caricatured as villains by the left, individuals on the left who are caricatured as terrorists, aliens. They call the Black Lives Matter activists on the far right, being subversives and treasonous. Individuals aren't, so people on these sides aren't looking at the individuals on the other side as real people who should have the right to speak and freely espouse their ideas and views. They're looking at them as enemies, as rivals, even though they're members of the same country and citizens of the same country. So it's a problem of real, genuine discourse that needs to be changed in this country. And if it isn't changed anytime soon, we're going to continue down this really frightening, pathway of potential violent conflict.
Tara, let me bring you back into this and just ask you, when we move forward into whatever this future looks like over the next couple of years, something that Khaled said, which I think is true, he mentioned about this soundbite kind of political point of view. A lot of that, I think comes from media, right? We have a media culture that embraces that celebrates that idea and really manipulates through it. How do you think people can become better informed? How can they open up their mind to say, I'm not going to just listen to what those sound bites say. I'm not going to live in a meme culture where my politics is based on every meme that I see that's easily manipulated. How do people wake themselves up and say, I want to be better informed on these things?
The step forward is to apply critical thinking and critical thought. So to question, where is this soundbite coming from? Is it within its full context? Because if you have to understand what happened before, what happened afterwards, and to realize that when you're seeing something that as it's presented on the media or even on social media, which is such a flat dimension, and when we're judging an entirety, especially a human, based on this singularity that's being presented to us, we have to critically question it. And if we have the opportunity to do more independent research or even have discussions, if this clip has to or if this soundbite has to do with somebody that we're able to outreach and talk to, because it's really, in a free society, it's this civil discourse that needs to occur. And that's part of the human element in communication that's missing, because most of our communication is going to be in tone. So we're often attributing our own emotions onto what we're seeing or what we're hearing. And with that, it's flat, and it's going to take on that sort of life. And then if we think a certain way, it's going to feed into that narrative that's in our mindset. So in order to move forward and to provide this unity, we need to question what we're seeing, do our independent research, and open up those discussions with people.
Absolutely. Tara Szczepanski, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today. We appreciate it. Khaled, let me come back to you. This concept of what Tara is talking about here, of, opening your mind, as we think back through history, certainly throughout history, there have been movements that are moved forward through activism. There are movements that are moved forward initially through, in some forms of violence. That is true historically. But overall, if we look at the overall arc of civilization, it's through the thinkers, through people who begin to be compassionate towards each other, who care about each other, who recognize that people have more in common than they do that makes them different. How do we return to a concept of being more thoughtful in our process and actually caring about people before politics? Because I feel like the politics can be manipulated so easily. They can be shifted so easily by those who are in power. How do we do that so that when we talk about politics, when we talk about these issues of activism, we're doing so in an intelligent way?
Well, let's not sterilize history. First of all, let's not sterilize American history. What Tara said is all great. It really sounds theoretically appealing. But American history is one where, white folks and white supremacy has essentially, capitalized and built power and mounted power on the back of silencing non-white people, right? Denying them the right to free speech, denying them the right to assembly, pummeling the progress of marginalized minorities in this country for a long time. So this culture of denial of First Amendment free speech rights, assembly rights, and all that comes with that is built on the back of a very long-standing American history of predominantly white gatekeepers in government and beyond government, suppressing and repressing the rights of individuals who are non-white. So we don't have this, let's not buy into this mythology that the United States has always been a place where progress has always been built on the back of individuals having free discourse and humanizing individuals on the other side. That's never been the case in the United States, right? So this culture of repressing and denying speech and sort of flattening genuine intellectual discourse has never been in existence in the United States in any sort of like robust, genuine fashion. So we have to establish that precedent for the first time now.
Yeah, let me push back a little bit on that, because just historically, what you're saying, I without question, look, when the founding happened and for many decades in this country, centuries in this country, right? You're absolutely right. The rights, as we call them today, right, where we have this belief that rights belong to every human being, was not the belief of the founders. Certainly, that is true.
Oh, black people are human beings.
Correct. Absolutely correct. But isn't it also true that when we look at, like, for instance, the women's rights movements and the civil rights movement, that those movements were based upon the ideals that came about in the founding? Because you have to have some basis for that. And they were, if you go back to how the activist leaders and the vocal leaders of those movements based their case, it a lot of times was based upon the concepts that were based in the founding. Is that true or untrue?
Yeah. That is true, right? But concepts are concepts. Theory is theory. They don't always manifest in actuality on the ground, right? So when we're talking about the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, this was a movement that was led and only included white women, right? Black women weren't part of the women's rights movement. Mexican women weren't part of the women's rights movement. Indigenous Native American were part of the women's rights movement. So you have to talk about race and racism throughout American history as being sort of a denier, right? Whiteness being a denier of who gets to be part of these movements and how these concepts play out and are practiced on the ground. And that's what is, let's be honest right now, in this country, what's going on is racial polarization as a consequence of America's longstanding history of denying basic human and civil rights to individuals who are not white. That is the sort of engine behind the Black Lives Matter movement and why it's been so resonant and powerful. It's been the first time in many respects, sort of building on the foundation of the civil rights movement, where Black people and more broadly non-white people have been denying full-fledged access to their rights in ways that have been denied for them for centuries.
Khaled Beydoun, thank you so much for your insight on this. Very interesting stuff, and I appreciate you going back into history to help kind of explain where our history has not been so perfect, and so we have to build from that. So thank you for that. We're going to bring into the conversation now John Barnes, a famous footballer from the UK. And John, if we can bring you in here, thanks so much for being with us. I know you've been listening to this conversation, bits and pieces of it, but you have a fascinating story. And I got to tell you, really excited to know that you were coming on the show today, because I feel that you have been kind of at the center of race discussions for a long time. So, let's get a little bit from you just in terms of where we are right now. And you're in the UK. The US and the UK, I know you have said, have almost identical racial issues in how we're dealing with them. How do you see the parallels between the two right now, the US and the UK? And where do you see maybe that there might be some differences in those issues?
Well, firstly, I don't know what a racial dissent actually means, because, of course, I always engage in racial discourse, and it's a very serious topic. It depends on what our interpretation of racism is. Black people in England and Black people in America go through the same thing. They're disproportionately represented in terms of access to social care, housing, education, because of their race. And of course, while a feature in England isn't people being murdered by police or getting shot by police, because white people don't get murdered or shot by police here as much as on the odd occasion Black people do. That seems to be a lot of the narrative in America. But for me, Black Lives Mattering and the what Black people go through in both countries are similar. I don't like to highlight what I call the sexy instances of a George Floyd or a high profile person, Black people not being given Oscars or actors not being given opportunities. I want to highlight the average Black person going through what they go through every day, which is disenfranchisement, not being given access to social care, not being given access to housing, and being discriminated against generally. And it's very similar what's happening in America, whereby we then have an elite group of Black people, similar to what's happening here, in terms of them, and this has happened throughout history, an elite group of people who want to elevate themselves into positions of power and using the masses as an excuse to then say, I'm representing the people, but I'm the one who's getting elevated into positions of power, and nothing changes for them. So until we start to change what's happening down below for the average Black person, nothing will change. I'll use Tarana Burke as an example in the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement in America was about young Black girls being abused in the inner cities. A Hollywood actress took it over, and now the Me Too movement is about Harvey Weinstein and Hollywood actors. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee, is to highlight the injustices in the inner city, not high-profile cases. And he mentioned police brutality as one of them, but now all of the cases are now forgotten about because it's about George Floyd or it's about Black footballers and their rights to take a knee. And the same thing's happening here.
So this is specifically why I wanted to talk to you today, because this idea, and I've read some of what you have written about this and spoken about this in the past. You talk a lot about racial incidents, that there's too much attention on racial incidents as opposed to systemic racism and the problems of racial groups that are not resolved through this. On some level, when we see activists here in the United States or in the UK as well, who take to the streets and they demand justice and social justice, are they getting played to an extent? Are they being played by those who are in power who say, yeah, we stand with you, but we're not going to change anything. Yes, we run a big corporation and we'll put money into a foundation, but we won't necessarily change our hiring practices or even the way that our company or our bank, for instance, deals with people who fall again under those issues of systemic racism.
Well, they are changing. What they're doing is giving elite Black people positions of power to then try and prove and fool people into thinking things are changing. And of course, those allies, those Black allies are saying, yes, things are changing. And when we get more people like me, the elite, into the positions of power, then you can see things are moving forward. I say, let's do it the other way around. Let's now get the average Black person, and more, because they're more than 90% of the average Black person, give them respect, give them equal opportunities, give them access to jobs and housing equal to white people, and then you'll have many more Black people getting to the higher echelons of society. So, but of course, this has happened throughout history. From the American Revolution. The American Revolution was never about the American people. It was about giving the elite in America more power, and nothing changed for the people down below. The French Revolution, the American civil rights, it's always about getting an elite group into positions of power. So you have to look at class as well as color when you're talking about that, because of course, you're looking at how in England, we have this thing about, right, we want to be a visible representation of Black people in television and in the media. And of course, we are now more than 20% represented. We're only 3% Black people. So we're having an overrepresentation at the elite level on television of Black presenters, Black people in television, but nothing changes for the 90% of Black people down below. And the more we see that and we say, yes, things are changing, nothing will change for the masses. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, not on a class perspective, sorry, not on a color perspective, but on a class perspective. This has to do with an elite group of people trying to elevate themselves out of their status, or where of the space.
So when we were talking earlier at the beginning of the show, and I was bringing up the racial issues in America really began to, and you can track this with a lot of different charts, really began to take center stage in the media just after the Occupy Wall Street movement began. The Occupy Wall Street movement began here in the U.S., and it was a push to say that the financial systems in America are gamed, they are rigged, and that the average person not only has no shot, but has less opportunity every year than the previous year. And all of a sudden, we saw the New York Times triple, quadruple the number of mentions of race within their papers. And we began to see that happen with a lot of different publications. They really began to focus on racial divide in this country. And what they were really pushing back against is trying to ignore what you're talking about, class divide, that there are a lot of people, regardless of skin color, there is an ever-growing pool of people in America and across the world who are increasingly poor every year, who increasingly have no opportunity every year, and there is a smaller and smaller number of people, you're describing them as the elites, a smaller and smaller number of people who have the opportunity and hold the wealth. Is some of what's happening in terms of this racial divide a distraction to that reality?
It always was a distraction to that reality, because before it was a racial issue, and of course it was an issue in class for hundreds of years. It was an issue with the Irish and the Italians, Southern Italians in America in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And of course, you then have certain amount of Irish people who are now elevated themselves out of that. But from a racial point of view, it's exactly the same. And now we're assuming that once we get a black person into a position of power, things will change. We had Obama. You now got Kamala Harris, and that's not going to change. And the system has to change, not individuals getting into that system and changing it, because they can't. They just become a part of it. Now, I'm not a socialist necessarily. I'm talking about a revolution. However, why don't we have a better balance between socialism and capitalism? Because that's what this is really about. That's what it's about. And black people are disproportionately represented in the lower economic echelons of society. So therefore, black people are then the ones who are being discriminated against. Not necessarily because they're black. They use the race as an excuse, because you're always going to need to, in the society we live in, you're always going to have to exploit people, because this is what we do in a capitalist society. And of course, black people are used to exploit, because you can then say the race is an issue because of the perception of their worth and their intellect, and therefore they are morally less than us, so therefore that's why there should be.
You talked about the Me Too movement, and I've heard this said before, and you were talking about young black girls in the inner city. I've also heard that the Me Too movement began with young black women who were actually in women's prisons, who were being sexually abused in those prisons. And as you said, the Me Too movement, it took off in a different way, and that doesn't discount the women in different positions around society who have also been abused and wanted to speak out about it. But to your point that you made, and I want to go back to this, of the initial women who were involved in this movement, the initial women that this was supposed to bring attention to, it's never brought attention to them. So it's fine if other women come into it and say, this is my experience as well. But to ignore the initial women who were suffering, who I would be willing to wager are still suffering as a result of that, because the abuse is still real in their lives. Again, it goes back to this idea of being sidetracked. So how do we prevent that? How do activists who say, no, I really do want to bring attention to a very real, very severe issue, how do they stay on track and not get co-opted?
How they stay on track is the people who are in the public eye, which I was 20 years ago when I was 30. How old am I? Yes, 30 years ago when I was John Barnes superstar footballer. I could have brought it to the attention. John Barnes at 57 now can't, because I'm an ex-footballer. Nobody knows me anymore. I haven't got that power. The Marcus Rashfords, the footballers do have it. The black actors in Hollywood, the black superstars have it. So what I would urge them to do, instead of saying how terrible it is because they can't get Oscars or they can't get black people into film, what they should do is say, yes, we do need to do both. We do need to have a representation, a black representation at the highest level. But what's more important is housing and education for our young black kids. I use Raheem Sterling as an example. When he gives 250 cup final tickets to Manchester City, some kids in the black inner city, Stonebridge Park, where he comes from, instead of giving them 250 cup final tickets to come to the cup final, you should take them to a press conference and say, these kids aren't being given an education, aren't being given opportunities. That's going to change their lives. What Marcus Rashford did, in highlighting the problem, and this wasn't a color issue, but it was a underprivileged issue, which you can then say color plays a part in that. He highlighted that issue whereby he said these kids aren't being given school meals because their parents can't afford it. He changed government policy. What he could have done was given them just £250,000 out of his own pocket. And that would have fed them for that summer. But how is that going to help them later on in life? Whereas he used his platform as a superstar to then talk about, forget about me and forget about racism, a banana coming on the field and somebody in Bulgaria racially abusing me, which is all over the newspapers, and we think that's what racism is. He says, if he uses his profile to then say, this is the bigger problem, not the fact that I'm a black footballer and a banana may come on the field. Yes, that's an issue. What's a bigger issue is these young black kids aren't being given jobs or education. Black Lives Matter. Yes, it just seems that Black Lives Matter if only you're killed by a white policeman. What about the young black kids who are being killed disproportionately in the inner cities? And it may be by other black people, but it's not a black problem. It's an inner city socioeconomic problem. And once we sort that problem out, then they'll stop killing each other. But no one's talking about the thousands of black kids who are being killed unless they're being killed by a white policeman. And that is what we have to do. We have to not stop looking at these sexy highlights of racism because a white man's killing a black man. What about when things are being done and we're ignoring that situation? Just like the Me Too movement of the black girls in prison or the young black kids in the inner cities. No one cares about them. What we care about is the Hollywood actress who Harvey Weinstein abused.
So to your point, when you're talking about the inner cities and you're talking about how to resolve some of these big issues, why are those being ignored? Is it because the problems are just too big and it's easier to deal with the one individual who's complaining that it's unfair? Or is it because, again, we're being rolled here and we're made to believe that we have all these high-level people in society who deeply care, but at the end of the day, they really just deeply care about more power for themselves, more wealth, furthering their own career? Is that what it is?
That's what's been happening for 1,000 years. You look at the Russian Revolution. You look at the Mexican Revolution. Once a lot of these people who purport to represent the people get a bit of power, they forget the people and they look after themselves. And that's always happened. And why should we now as black people feel we're different? Because black people go through this. You look at what goes on in the black countries in terms of black people discriminated. Looking in the Caribbean, you can look what happens in Africa, whereby black people are being discriminated against by other black people. That's got nothing to do with color. That's to do with exploitation, to do with people wanting to make more money and they have to exploit someone. And it's not a racial issue in these countries, but it's exploitation of the working classes. So therefore, but from a color perspective, you have a double-edged sword whereby you have the race issue and also the class issue. And of course, the idea of give a black man a position and then he will help you up the ladder because black people look after each other. That has never happened and it won't happen. And until we understand that, or we hold people to account to say, stop talking about how terrible it is for John Barnes. John Barnes can't get a job as a manager because of racial discrimination. I understand that, the perception of my ability, I understand that, but I've got a nice house, I've got a nice car, I'm okay. So yes, we can fight against that, but what is more important is the disenfranchisement of the black people in the inner cities. And if John Barnes has a voice and a platform, that's what he should use it for.
And then lastly on that, the last thing I'd ask you about is, in the event that we started to focus on those issues of the inner city people or people, again, across socioeconomic barriers, regardless of their race, and we said, how do we take people who have no opportunity and are struggling and are surrounded in poverty and violence and bring them up out of it? If that was the focus, wouldn't it be easier for John Barnes to be able to manage a football team simply because we would be less focused on racial issues and more focused on people issues and looking at people as people? Last word.
No, because for John Barnes to be given, or any black manager to be given an opportunity, we have to change his perception of his worth intellectually. You don't have that problem from a physical point of view now. From Jackie Robinson, who started playing baseball, that was not a situation whereby they wanted to give him a position because they wanted racial equality. They knew that they could win with him. It was a transaction, a positive transaction financially, that they know Jackie Robinson is going to hit home runs so we can win. Now, that is obvious from a sporting perspective. When you're talking about a leadership position in terms of management, morality, intellectual, we have to change our perception of a black man's ability to do that before he actually shows that. Because, of course, we had the greatest man in the world being black, Obama. Has that changed anything in terms of the perception of the average black person? No. We elevated Obama out of the space where the majority of society sees black and say, yes, he can do it, but can other black people do it? No, we don't think they can. Now, until we change our perception of the average black person, not the brilliant black person, and elevate him out of the space where we think is negative, we have to change our perception of the average black person.
John Barnes, former footballer and I believe one-day manager of a team. Thank you so much for being with us and being a part of this conversation. We do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, that is our podcast for today. I hope you enjoyed it. So much information out of there. We had another guest we were hoping to get to with the Boogaloo Boys, but unfortunately we ran out of time. So our apologies to Magnus. Thanks for trying to be on, but unfortunately we ran out of time. That is our show for today. We'll be back here next week, a whole new subject and a whole new lineup of guests. We appreciate you being with us. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it on all platforms. We'll see you back here next week.